everyone. So in this lecture, we are going to discuss graphene. What is graphene? By definition, this is the single layer which is defect-free. Single layer of graphite. So it must be defect-free and it must be one single layer only, then you call it graphene by definition. However, you will hear the terms like bilayer graphene and multi-layer graphene and also even defect-containing graphene. So we are going to discuss all of these things and we are going to discuss, why is there this confusion and what is graphene as such. Okay. So this is one transmission electron microscope. I purposely showed you this picture because this is a picture not of a single layer graphene separately prepared. This is a picture of a bulk industrial carbon. And even in bulk industrial carbons, you will often find these kind of structures, graphene-like structures or graphenes, because graphene is indeed the building block of all the carbon materials except diamond-like materials. So anything that has sp2 or even sp2 plus n-type hybridization is somehow related to graphene because it contains these hexagonal structures. So this is a picture where you can see graphene-like sheets in this is from glass-like carbon. Okay, so for us, graphene has been a material which was used for preparing graphite, right? So this, if you have gone through the previous lectures in this course, you know that when we make highly oriented pyrolytic graphite, we first pyrolyze a hydrocarbon, we get pyrolytic graphite. Why pyrolytic graphite? Because these are graphite-like sheets. These are flat sheets rather than curved carbon structures. So they have some waviness, but still there is a possibility that they can be converted into graphite. And that's why we use the terms like pyrolytic graphite, pyrographite. Also, often pyrocarbon is also a term that is used, but the idea is that these are flat structures. Now, we anneal them at very high temperatures or we perform hot pressing or something, so we can convert it into pyrolytic graphite and then followed by highly oriented pyrolytic graphite at higher temperatures. Okay, this is what we have learned. This is an industrial process that has been used for several decades now. Now, what happened in the last couple of decades is that people realize that this raw material doesn't really need to be converted into graphite. We can also use the individual flakes, because these individual flakes indeed offer very interesting properties. Why? Because, well, you know everything about this pi electron that we have. We have this unhybridized p orbital in our sp2 carbons, and that electron, the electron in that unhybridized orbital, is indeed responsible for all the interesting properties. When we have 3D structure, AB A-type structure, or even turbostratic structure, the influence of that pi electron is a bit lost. But in the case of a single layer, that is the effect is very dominant. So in that case, why not just use this individual flake as for certain electronic applications, because the electronic properties are also very interesting, the mechanical properties. So this is how this graphene developed. We used it in the past for making graphite. Okay, now you would say that maybe the term graphene is new. In the past it was called single layer graphite, but now it is called graphene. Well, even this terminology was also suggested by IUPAC in 1994. So it is not very new. Okay, so ene is the suffix that we use with a lot of carbon materials, a lot of hydrocarbons. So for example, annulenes and naphthalene, you know the examples. Okay, and graph comes from graphite. Okay, so we use this. We started using this term graphene. However, the term only in the early 21st century we started using it more extensively, more commonly. But the term can be found in the literature also. After 95. Okay. So what do we have here? You know that you have sigma bonds and pi bonds. This is something we already, so I would in fact recommend that you also go through the crystal structure of graphite, the lecture on crystal structure of graphite, also pyrolysis of hydrocarbons and HOPG, highly oriented pyrolytic graphite preparation. All of these lectures are also very strongly connected to the graphene lecture. This is not completely independent, because after all we are talking about the structural unit of graphite. Okay, so we have 3 sigma bonds. You know that we have sp2 hybridization. So you have 3 sigma bonds, and then there is one unhybridized p orbital and one pi bond. Now the 6 pi bonds. So yeah, I have some graphene for you here. So the 6 you have this kind of structure. This is just an individual hexagon. We also have many such hexagons connected to each other. Okay, also on top and so on. Okay, so you have 6 electrons. So when we learned about hybridization, there also we talked about all of these things in detail. So these 6 electrons from the pi orbitals will then form a cloud. They become delocalized, and that is what leads to all the interesting properties. You also know one more thing when we talk about this pyrolytic graphite or graphene sheets. Then we talk about turbostratic structures. So again, you have, this is one hexagon, and this is another. So if you have ABABA type arrangement, which will look something like this, then you have graphite. But if you have a completely random rotation, so it can be at any angle, that is your turbostratic structure. So it can be at any angle. So this is the turbostratic structure. So instead of annealing, now we are already stopping at the turbostratic structure. So your multi-layer graphene will have, if you have like 5 layers of graphene, this will definitely have a turbostratic structure, because it has not been annealed at higher temperatures yet. If you use a single layer of graphene, which is what graphene should be, then there is no question of turbostratic or ABABA arrangement, because we are then talking only about the single layer. Okay, so the point is, all the interesting properties of graphene, or at least most of them, are because of this pi band, which is the delocalized, the cloud of all the electrons sitting in these unhybridized orbitals. Okay. How about the mechanical properties? Well, mechanical properties are actually determined by the sigma bond. So sigma bond is the bond between these carbons that are, this carbon plus this carbon, for example. So the in-plane bonds, these are the sigma bonds. Sigma bonds actually determine the mechanical properties. What is very interesting is that the bond length in the case of graphene, that is 1.42 angstrom. In the case of diamond, it is 1.54 angstrom, which basically means that you have a shorter bond length in the case of graphene, which would in principle make it mechanically stronger than diamond. And that is why you will also hear that graphene is the strongest material on earth. It is much stronger than diamond. So whenever you hear these kind of things, you should understand what is the scientific reason behind it, rather than just thinking of graphene as a wonder material. Because you should make sure, this is especially for the students, I'm saying, that make sure that you are, when you're talking about a new fancy material, so to say, you remain scientific in your approach. Don't just start believing in graphene. You should understand what are the properties of graphene. Why do we call it mechanically strong? So this is because the bond length, the carbon-carbon bond length in the case of graphene is shorter than that of diamond. However, you know that for technological applications, if you want to make a cutting tool, you will rather use diamond. How? Because the property that we are describing here is for a single layer of graphene, defect-free single layer. And in that case, can you have these very large crystals, very large 2D crystals? Even if you do have very large 2D crystals, in that case, can you use it in a cutting tool? Will it not have the flexibility? Because these are sheet-like structures. So there are all these things, and you need to make sure that you understand that even though this is in principle the strong material or stronger than diamond, for the technological applications, still you will use diamond. Okay, so these are some of the things about graphene. Also, sigma bonds, they result in a strong wave function overlap with its nearest neighbors. These are the properties that are basically used for, number one, describing the pi band. Number two, also describing the Hamiltonian of graphene. This is something, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the vectors that we use for some of the crystal structure parameters that I'm going to discuss in the next couple of slides. However, maybe I will not go too much into the details of the physics. There are reasons. I will recommend some other NPTEL lectures. So these are some of the concepts that are already available within NPTEL. Okay. Anyway, our goal is going to be manufacturing. How do we make graphene? What are the properties that are for technological applications very important? So this is going to be our primary goal. Okay. There are many properties. One of them is also the optical transparency of graphene. This is interesting because then you can actually see the graphene sheet under an optical microscope. And you can actually have very nice, you can actually see the edges of graphene under an optical microscope. You can actually search for these kind of optical images of graphene, and then you will find many such images. So this material, like all carbon materials, offers some sort of optical transparency, but only when there is a single layer. When it is a multi-layer structure like graphite, then it does not offer transparency to the light in the visible wavelength. Okay. Yeah, so I have already mentioned that the term graphene should only be used for single and defect-free layers, but yeah, that is not the case. We also use multi and bi-layer structures. I think the reason for that is that when we make pyrolytic graphite, or hydrocarbon is pyrolyzed on top of a certain substrate, in that case you do have these wavy sheets, you have these turbostratic sheets, a lot of them. They also contain some defect and so on. Before we anneal them out, what do we call that material? So if we use it in bulk, we call it pyrographite. But when we are using individual sheets, now let's say individual sheet separation is very difficult. It's extremely difficult to obtain. This needs to be highly controlled. We will talk about this when we talk about the manufacturing process. But this is very difficult to get defect-free individual sheets. So you will often end up getting sheets which are, turbostratic and which are more than one sheets. So what do you call them? You cannot call them graphite, because graphite is that it needs to have an ABABA arrangement. You can also not call them glass-like carbon or any other non-graphitizing carbons, because non-graphitizing carbons have the curved carbon structure. So what is that material? When you have a few sheets of sp2 hybridized carbon, but they are randomly rotated on top of each other, they are turbostratic. So in that case, you can just call them multi-layer graphene for convenience. But graphene, by as per the IUPAC definition, is only the single and defect-free layer. Okay, coming to the crystal structure of graphene. This is something very important to us. Okay, you see this kind of diagram. You must have seen it multiple times also in this this course when we were talking about graphite and so on. You see that I have drawn two types of atoms. One is in blue color and one is in orange color. Okay, first of all, yeah, these kind of structures are also known as honeycomb structures. These are basically just hexagons connected to each other. Honeycomb because, well, honeybees make these kind of structures. So they seem to be very smart and they came up with a very good, structural design. So they are making hexagons. Okay, never mind. So this is our graphene structure. Okay. What is very important for us to understand in terms of crystal structure is why do we have these A and B sites? Why do they look different? Why did I draw them using two different colors? The point is that we need to, we cannot take just one atom of this entire structure as your crystal lattice. So what is a crystal lattice again? What is the unit cell? Unit cell is the smallest repeating unit in any crystal. Okay, primitive unit cell is what we call it. This is the smallest one which can exist, and if we repeat it, then we should always get the same structure. So when it comes to selecting this primitive unit cell, it becomes very important whether it is just one atom. Why don't we just take one atom or one complete hexagon as the unit cell? Why make it more complicated? So the idea is that in that particular unit cell, then you should have you should be able to repeat the entire structure. And can we do it if, let's say, we select one single atom? The answer is no, because the atoms A and B, as I have mentioned here, are not equivalent. Why are they not equivalent? So if you move from A to B, and you move, let's say 1.42 angstrom. So after A, after 1.42 angstrom, you will find the atom B. Okay, but if you move from B, if you move further in the same direction, then up after 1.42 angstrom, there is nothing. So this means that A and B are not equivalent. Okay, so this is as simple as that. Okay, however, after B, if you again move, let's say you move a little bit up or down to the next nearest neighbor, in that case, after 1.42 angstrom, there is something. But here you will not find anything, somewhere here. Okay, so, well, the nearest neighbor is not equivalent, but the next nearest neighbor is equivalent. So basically you only have two types of atoms and not more than that. So you have A and B type atoms. Okay, that does not mean that there is any chemical difference between these two atoms. They are both carbon atoms, they behave the same, everything is same about them, but in terms of crystal geometry, they are not equivalent. Okay. So yeah, we also cannot take the entire hexagon, because again you will see that you don't have this what is known as translational symmetry. Translation basically means, well, moving in one direction, not rotating, just moving like that. That is known as translation. So you should be able to basically from A to B, you should be able to reach with just one translation operation, which is not possible because A and B are not equivalent. Okay, now how do we select the unit cell? Selection of unit cell was also, when we were talking about graphite, you know, the first thing, that the very intuitive thing that will come to you is, why don't we take the entire hexagon? Why do we take 3 layers in the case of graphite? So the point is that, again, you need to have a repeating unit. So in the case of graphene, sorry, for me, graphene is still 2D graphite. Okay. So in the case of graphene, what you have is this gray region that I have shown. It's a rhombus. Rhombus, because this again we did in the case of graphite, so I'm not going to repeat it. But this angle here is 120 degrees, and this angle here is 60 degrees. Okay, so this is known as a rhombus structure. This gray area is our unit cell. Now you have one A atom, one B atom. What is a little bit non-intuitive here again is that when you select this primitive unit cell or this lattice, you do not have atoms at the corner, all corners of the lattice. And that is why it is sometimes not very intuitive. Okay, however, there is also another option of selecting the unit cell. And in fact, in some of the publications, you find this other, the one with I have shown with the black rhombus. This is also a way of selecting the unit cell of graphene. Okay, if you will see that this is pretty much the same, the shape is exactly the same. The number of atoms is also exactly the same. In the case of the gray one, you will see that you have 2 complete atoms inside the unit cell, so the total number of atoms is 2. If you also calculate it for the other one, you will still find 2. See, because you have again, this calculation was done when we talked about crystal structure of graphite, and I definitely recommend that you go through that lecture. You will again, there is one full atom. But it is of course shared with top atom and bottom atom, top layer and bottom layer. In the case of graphite, here you just need to make sure that you do not divide your atom in half, because there is no top or bottom layer. But if you calculate the number of atoms, it remains the same. Again, in this particular structure, you will find 2 atoms. In the case of graphite, we had 1 because of the sharing of top and bottom. Okay. So these 2 are, accepted crystal primitive unit cells for graphene. Okay, you see A1 and A2 I have shown with the red arrows. These are the lattice vectors. Okay, so what else? The lattice vectors are also, now if you just notice that here I have shown again with these arrows, lattice vectors can also be taken this way. And so again, in the literature, at some point you will find this these 2 A1 and A2 lattice vectors, or you will find these kind of lattice vectors. This angle here is 120, and that is why so traditionally or conventionally, when you are choosing the lattice vectors in the case of a rhombus, you will often choose the ones that form an obtuse angle. So that is why there is a community of scientists which believes that the lattice vector should be taken like this, like the second strategy and not the first one. So all of these things exist, and you will find different types of crystal structures in different publications. Okay. Now, one more thing that is important is that there is something known as the sublattice of graphene. So sublattice is nothing but if you draw a line here, and then you have, these 2 triangles. So now if I take this triangle here, this one, then you have one center atom, and then that center atom, which is of A type, is connected to 3 B atoms, the neighboring B atoms. This can be called a sublattice. So one sublattice in this type of geometry would have these, one central atom, but on the other side it is empty. Anyway, these are also known as graphene sublattices, and there are also certain vectors that define these sublattices, or these which connect the 2 sublattices. So we are going to quickly talk about all of these things. Okay, this region, so now the shaded region that I have drawn here, this is what is known as the sublattice of graphene. Okay, these kind of structures are also often visible in some of these very nice transmission electron micrographs. This particular image is also present as the title image of your course. This is a very beautiful structure that we found in glass-like carbon. Again, this is not a picture of multi-layer graphene or single-layer graphene. This is a picture of glass-like carbon. And however, you can see these triangular junctions. And these triangular junctions are also present in this. These are present in all kind of sp2 carbon structures. Okay, now let us briefly talk about some of these crystal parameters before we move further.
Okay, so here I have again drawn the primitive unit cell of graphene. So this is your image number 1. And here you can see also atoms A and B that are two non-equivalent sites. You can see A1 and A2. These are your primitive lattice vectors. Okay, now we are going to define another set of vectors which is very useful for calculating various properties related to graphene. For example, for calculating the Hamiltonian of graphene, or for calculating the electronic band gap of graphene and other electronic properties accordingly. So we are going to use this diagram number 2 for this purpose. So this set of vectors, basically it connects the two sublattices of graphene. So what are the two sublattices? We know that we have A-type atoms and B-type atoms. So what you actually need to do is pick any one A-type atom and connect it with all its B-type neighbors. So in this particular case, these are the B-type neighbors. So you can also do it for yourself. If this is B, this is A here, and then B again, and then A again, you will find that these are these will be the neighbors that will be the B-type neighbors. Okay. Now the vectors that we are talking about, these are the 3 vectors. So this is number 1, number 2, and number 3. Okay. So in the literature, sometime you will find the name B1, B2, B3 for these vectors, and sometimes you will find the name delta 1, delta 2, delta 3. We are going to use B1, B2, and B3 here. Okay, so you just need to calculate the value of these vectors. What does that mean? That means that you need to find the coordinates of the point. So for example, if I take this B point, so for all 3 B neighbors, we need to find the the coordinates. Okay, so for this one, well, this is just simply 1 and 0 because this is our x-axis and this is the y-axis. So this is easy. For this second B point, although this is also very simple geometric calculations, I will show it to you here. Okay, so for this purpose, we are going to use this image number 3, this diagram number 3 here. Okay, so you can see this is your A site, and this is your B site where you would like to reach. Okay, now if I draw a line here, then the distance, this distance here is half. Of course, the edge length of your hexagon is assumed to be 1 in all cases. So this one is half, and this of course is the edge length, so this is equal to 1. Now using very simple trigonometric calculations, you can find out. So this angle here is 90, and this one is 60, and this one here is 30. Okay, so now you can very easily calculate that this is root 3 by 2. So what are the coordinates again for this point? Now the coordinates will be minus half and root 3 by 2. Okay, similarly, if you want to calculate it for this B site, what you're going to get is minus half and minus root 3 by 2. Okay, now accordingly you can define your vectors. So you can what is your vector number B1? B1 equals now your x cap into 1, and y is 0 here. So this into 1, and this is 0 here, your y coordinate. Okay, in the case of B2, what you have minus half into x cap plus root 3 by 2 into y cap, and accordingly you can also calculate B3. Okay, another type of vector, that is a set of vectors that is used for some of the calculations. For example, if you want to use the reciprocal vectors and you want to use the orthogonality relationships, in that case you might require what is known as the translation vectors. So what are translation vectors? Translation basically means you need to move in one direction. If you move in one direction, how much distance is required for one A site to reach another A site, or B to B basically. So you have your A type atoms here, here and here. Okay, and you can easily see how long does it, what is the distance between A and A. So this one here is your T1 vector. Translation 1. This one here is your T2 and this here is your T3. Now what is very useful when you use these T1, T2 and T3 type vectors, you can now represent these vectors in the form of your B1, B2 and B3 vectors for various calculations. Okay. Now one more concept that we are going to learn is the concept of Brillioun zone. Okay, so what is the Brillioun zone? Again, what you need, so here we are going to use this last image. So you take the lattice point, any lattice point. So in the case of graphene, generally these lattice points are not very, not very obvious because they don't contain atoms at their corner. But you know that this is our, primitive lattice, and it's a primitive unit cell. So what you can do is you can take the corner atom of this one here, this the corner here. This, remember that there is no atom sitting there. Okay. Now what you need to do is you need to connect this point to all the nearest neighbors. So these 6 atoms are the nearest neighbors, right? And what you can do is now you can draw lines here. And I will tell you why. Now, once we draw all these lines, then what you need to do is you need to draw perpendicular bisectors of all these lines. So, for example, this one, and then the perpendicular bisector of this one, and similarly for all 6 of them, you need to draw these bisecting lines. And what you get is what is known as the first Brillioun zone. Okay, so basically what you have here, now this does not look like a perfect hexagon in this image, but basically you will get this first Brillioun zone also as the perfect hexagon in the case of graphene. And the center point is known as the gamma point. Okay.
Okay, so by now you already know that what are the important crystal parameters for us. These are the lattice vectors A1 and A2. The sub-lattice vectors, you can say, B1, B2, B3. One important thing about these sub-lattice vectors is that we are working in a two-dimensional space. So only 2 vectors are linearly independent. So you actually can write B3 in the form of B1 and B2. Okay, so this is important also. If you remember that when we were talking about the graphite crystal structure, we had C vector, yes, but then we also had A1, A2, and then A3 vector. A3 was again a linear combination of A1 and A2, and that is why you can have 2 types of Miller indices for graphite, HKL or HKIL, where I is actually it's a combination of the other lattice vectors. Okay, so similarly in the case of graphene, B1, B2, B3 are not all independent. Only 2 of them can be independent. We are working in a two-dimensional space. Okay, translation vectors T1, T2, T3 that you already know. And the first Brillioun zone also we have drawn, and you know that this is a hexagon. And this is how it looks like if you draw a good, good diagram, not like the one that I drew before. So this looks like a good hexagon, good symmetric hexagon. Okay, so you know that graphene is electrically conductive. In fact, it's its band gap and its electronic properties are of great interest not just to engineers but also to physicists, because this is a very nice experimental model. That can be used. Also theoretical studies, there are so many theoretical studies when it comes to graphene, because theoretically it's very easy to have the single layer, but it's not that easy when you actually perform the experiments, and that is anybody who has worked on graphene materials, they know that it's not easy to get the single layers. Anyway, the point is that, well, in the past it was believed that the single layers of any material or any 2D crystals are very unstable, but now when we are using graphene for a lot of technological applications, we know that these single layers can also be very stable. This is something also very similar to the to fullerenes, because before fullerenes were discovered, it was believed that curved carbon structures are not very stable. So, well, with carbon structures, you can always find some sort of arrangement that is stable, and the reason for that is there are so many carbon atoms, carbon bonds with itself, and that is why it always finds an overall stable geometry. That may not be stable for if you had only a few carbon atoms, let's say 10 or 20, but if you find a very large number of carbon atoms, then altogether overall stable geometry is something that is our most interesting property of our carbon material. Okay, so anyway, let's first talk about the electrical conductivity of graphene. So this is your graphene sheet. I said that this is conductive along what is known as the zig-zag direction. So there are two things about all hydrocarbons, all carbon materials: zigzag and armchair, like edges. And that is sort of a symmetry also defined in the terms of zigzag and armchair symmetry in the case of sp2 carbons. So what is this zigzag? Zigzag, as the name suggests, it is this zigzag structure, I think. Yeah, here. So this is the zigzag type geometry or path. And there is also something known as armchair symmetry. So armchair symmetry, basically, if you have, these are your two graphene sheets. If you move from here, here to here to here to here, so all the way. So this upper half of your hexagon, if you just see this kind of structure, that is known as one armchair. And if you have various hexagons connected, for example like this, if you move along the path that I just showed to you, like this, then that is known as the armchair symmetry. So you can imagine, if you have a large graphene sheet, at some point, wherever you have the edge, wherever your sheet ends, you are either going to find the zigzag-like geometry, or you're going to find the armchair-like geometry, right? Because these are the only two possible arrangements. You will have your hexagons like this. So if you see the edges, then they are right now hexagon. But if you have them like this, then, and if you see the top of this structure, then you have the armchair. So in the same structure, actually, the top is the top part is the armchair, and the sides are zigzag type. Okay, fine. So let's talk about the conductivity. It is conductive along this zigzag direction. Okay, because you can see the electron can very easily move. It's a well connected path. However, when you now, for the same structure, if you see sideways, then you have these. You don't have a perfect connectivity. You now have sort of a little bit of gaps here. Okay, so here the conductivity value, electrical conductivity value, should be slightly lower than what you have for the zigzag direction. Why? Because there is no there is a continuous path for electron to move, but it's not as straightforward as it was in the case of zigzag. However, these things are connected. It's not that the hexagons are not connected, it's just that the path is a little bit longer. Okay, so in this direction, actually, graphene sheet happens to be semi-conducting. But you will never know this when you're performing an experiment. If you connect your graphene sheet to some external circuitry, you will never be able to, because you cannot really differentiate between the zigzag and armchair paths that your electron is taking. The electron will always find some path. In fact, the path of the electron would often be a mixture of both armchair and zigzag paths, whatever is the most convenient one for the electron. Okay, so then you will just, when you're measuring the electrical conductivity of graphene, you will always get a certain value. You will never know which path was taken by the electron, whether it is, you will never know that it is semi-conducting. However, this you can guess when you make carbon nanotubes. So what are nanotubes? Tubes are basically folded. So if this is your graphene sheet and then you roll it up, then you get a carbon nanotube. Okay, now this was my structure. So it's good that this is a rectangular sheet of paper. So either I roll it up like this one that I just showed to you, or I roll it up from top like this. In that case, in one of these geometries is where I have the zigzag, and the other one I have the armchair. So in that case, actually, you will find in the case of carbon nanotubes, it's very clear when they have the armchair symmetry, that is also shown with this red color. When you have the armchair symmetry, you have semi-conducting carbon nanotubes. When you have the zigzag type symmetry, then you have conducting carbon nanotubes, or they are also known as metallic carbon nanotubes because they are conductors like metals. So there it becomes clear. Then now we know what happens to your graphene sheet. The third one is what is known as chiral carbon nanotube, and this also happens to be semiconductor. So how will I make a chiral sheet out of it? If I fold it, sideways, so like that, then what I get is, now it is sort of a combination of both. Okay, so this is something very interesting about graphene's electrical properties. Okay, yeah, so this is something you will only know when you make tubes. Because in the case of graphene, you will always find there is some path. This is, again, I have written something about the diamond and graphite, which is about the mechanical properties. Electrons in graphene do not behave in the same way as they would behave in graphite. That you know because of the fact that your pi electrons are now available, and they also because the structure is very, very thin. So the diameter of a carbon atom is approximately 0.14 nanometer. So this is a single atom thick layer. So this is extremely thin layer. And when you have structures below 10 nanometer, then there is something known as quantum confinement. A lot of properties of materials change when they are smaller than 10 nanometer, and that is why the electrons also behave differently in the case of graphene as they would in the case of graphite or other bulk carbon materials. Okay.